It's a pleasure to be here, and what I want to try to do is start from the beginning. And just for disclosure, the funding for this research is from the NIH. So trying to give you the big picture for this research, and when we step back and think of what these senses are doing, they're probably making one of the most important decisions an animal makes is whether to eat something or not. But the other way to look at it is many chronic diseases that are facing modern society are derived in large part by overconsumption of certain foods, which is dictated by our taste preferences. So these preferences, or these signals, are taking on even greater importance as some of us are living in environments of abundance. These patterns of poor food choice are evident even in the youngest members of our societies. And so what I want to focus on today is what is the sensory and what is the taste world of children? How do they learn to like new foods? What is the biology of taste and how does it reveal itself? One of the things that if you want to really step back and think of the question is how can we account for these patterns of food choice? Too much sweet, too much salt, too much fat, not enough vegetables or fruits that seem so antithetical to health. Why? Why is that the case? And I think the other big picture is to kind of think of where the selective pressures that were put on these senses. We evolved in environments in which these foods were scarce. These, especially the taste signals, are a very elegant biology that is attracting the child to that which they need, which sweet is our signal for energy, and calories, and mother's milk, what the child needs to survive when it enters the world, and also to avoid that which tastes bitter, because many bitters may also be poisonous. And so that really is the biology that the child is born with, and I want to just kind of review that as well. So the fundamental question is, why do we like the things that we do? And why, when we're looking at the current obesity epidemic that many, not only adults but children are finding themselves in, I think that these senses give insight into what children are eating and why they're eating. And in order to answer this question, why do we like what we do, we have to incorporate the biological substrate, which are the flavor senses. Our language is limited, I'll refer to as taste, but really, as Catherine mentioned, it's really a convergence of all these senses, flavor, the taste, smell, chemical irritants, the coolness of mint, that together provide the signal that identifies what a food is to us. So what's the machinery? All of these senses are developing before birth, but that doesn't mean that the baby is a miniature adult. There's an inherent plasticity, which makes sense because these are the signals for food, which is a basic biological commodity. There are inborn responses, yet inherent plasticity, and so the baby is open to learn about the flavors. So is there something happened with the film? Did it just totally disappear? So you can see by the near-term fetus is swallowing almost a liter of amniotic fluid a day. It has olfactory receptors and the taste receptors on the tongue are bathed in this amniotic fluid, which varies from morning to night and is dependent on the flavors of the diet the mother is eating. So for the limited time when I think one thinks about childhood, we think about sweet taste, which I think really kind of defines a child. And so what I want to do to you today is just it really has benefited from almost a century-long legacy of basic research in children. And the same challenges are faced when looking at a nonverbal animal. How does one ask the pre-verbal child what they like, what they detect? And you can see that it's coming from many, many different types of angles. And so some of the earliest work, whether you do a 2-bottle preference test, a baby within hours of birth will ingest more of a sweet-tasting solution than water. When you look at the sucking response, you can see that the baby, this is an unsweetened pacifier, and here's a sweetened one. The suck is much stronger, and you even see this in the premature baby born 25 to 36 weeks gestational age. So the ability to detect and prefer sweet is even evident before birth. This is a very phylogenetically conserved behavioral responses when sweet taste is put in the oral cavity, as well as umami taste. You'll see a facial relaxation. You'll see sucking responses initiated. And the one thing that I think we can't forget about with sweet taste is that it also blunts expressions of pain, which is now used in many hospital nurseries right before a heel prick procedure because it releases endogenous opioids and it makes children feel better. And this ability for sweets to blunt pain is also evident during childhood. A child can keep their hand in a cold water bath longer if a sweet liquid is in their mouth. So I think when the doctor used to give the lollipop after the shot, he probably should have given it before the shot, which helped. So probably the biggest difference in the world that children find themselves in is that they most prefer, we all like sweets, but the child most prefers a higher level of sweetness than the adult. And then it switches over to the adult-like pattern during mid-adolescence, the same period where salt decreases as well. And so to put this in perspective, it shouldn't be of a surprise, the level of sweetness that adults like is the level of sweetness you would find in a carbonated beverage. It's about a 0.3 molar sucrose. And children most prefer a 0.6 to 0.7 molar sucrose. So you put 7 cubes of sugar in that can of cola, and that's the bliss point for children. Another way to look at it is that if you had an 8-ounce glass of water, the adult bliss point would be 7 cubes. For children, it would be about 12. They really like sweet. And we've been able to show that it also is coinciding during periods of growth. You can measure a biomarker for bone growth in those children that have higher levels or preferring higher levels of sweet. These are the flags of all the countries that have done basic research in sweet taste in children. In all of these countries, children would prefer a higher level of sweet or prefer very high levels of sweet. It's a universal, I think it's a hallmark of childhood. And again, I think it's a very, very elegant biology because it's attracting children. What sweet taste is, it's our signal for mother's milk. It's one of the predominant taste qualities of mother's milk, as is umami, and also of carbohydrates. And so the child is really attracted towards sweet during periods of growth. So this is the good news. It's heightened, it blunts expressions of pain. The other thing that I didn't mention, that it's a great bitter masker. It can really get rid of the bad taste that is in a complex food. But when one thinks about it, it also shows the vulnerability that children have to a food environment that is rich in added sugars and salt. The same story could be told with salt as well. Now some of us find ourselves in where these foods are cheap, they're inexpensive, they're plentiful, and the child has a biology that is really attracted to that. And so if that is what's in their food environment, it's no surprising why they're going to be attracted to it. So this is just, I do work on the first taste of sweets and just try to phenotype children a different way. This is this little girl's first taste of a sweet, and she's the first one that started dancing. But I think when you see and we've all experienced it as well, this is why it's so hard not to give sweets. And the child is communicating in every way that they can, and everyone wants to bring pleasure to a child. It's not just a source of calories. This is something that's really preferred. Well, here's the same baby. We have a little broccoli juice in this cup. It's not like she likes anything, but that gets to the next little so the last she's going to do is drink. She's trying to get rid of it. So, which gets to bitter taste, as we've learned about. This is also an elegant biology that's protecting us from, until we learn to associate these taste with foods that are safe. It's protecting us from potentially being poisoned. And it's also, the other important thing is protecting the plant who's producing these bitter compounds from being ingested. So you have to look at the source as well as who's ingesting it. And so when we do a lot of work in looking at babies' first acceptance of foods, how can I get a baby to be, what kind of experiences do they need to be more accepting? And I think it's a general rule that the baby will be more accepting of fruits than vegetables, of orange than green vegetables. But that's the other thing that's remarkable about this taste system that we find ourselves talking about today, is there's inherent variation. And we all are living in different sensory worlds. I mean, this is personalized medicine at its best. And when we think of each of us in our own, not only as a result of our biology, but also as a result of the experiences and the food environments that we grew up in, and how we define ourselves as a food culture. And so I think what the other take-home message is that this biology, where you see that the baby being attracted to sweet or salt or rejecting bitter, is not our destiny. These senses are inherently plastic, because there are senses that are telling us about food, which is our biological commodity. So they're open to learning, as all of our cultures do. What is an appropriate food? How sweet should that food taste like? How salty? How savory? What is a food? What time of day should it be eaten? All of these are learned during childhood. Who eats what? When do I eat it? What does it taste like? And so this is what a child is learning, not only how to eat, but what to eat. And children learn to eat that which they experience. And so the first way that we learn about our environment, or the food environment that we are going to be born into, is from our mothers. Because the flavors of the foods that she eats, like every other mammal, are being transmitted to these first foods of amniotic fluid and mother's milk. They're taking on these odor volatiles that define a food. And the baby has a sensory system that can detect it. So she really is bridging and providing the child with information about, because what she's eating most likely is that which is going to be eaten by the child. And so these first foods reflect the diet, a lot of these volatiles, and this is an international body of research. It's not just what she eats. If she smokes cigarettes, they're pronounced flavor changes in her milk. Alcohol is one that also gets transmitted pretty rapidly into human milk. So it's a lot of sensory information that is being transmitted to mother's milk in ways that we're only now starting to learn about. So that means that every baby's experience is unique. It's dependent on what foods mom has available, what foods she likes, or at the very least what foods she's eating. And these early experiences will modify acceptance. If you can randomize mothers to different diets and then look at the baby's acceptance of those foods, and the baby will be more accepting of a flavor that had been eaten by the mother. So like other senses, we've also started to look at that there are sensitive periods. These are the senses that kind of lag behind the others. But there may be times during early life where we at least have some evidence in which it's not just that you experience it, but when you experience may be as important. We've talked about how it's very difficult to change the adult food habit. It seems that where the evidence is going is that a lot of what's being learned is in the first 2 years of life. That's why many cultures are placing emphasis on these early years to try to get children off to a good start. So you can randomize mothers to drink a variety of vegetable juices, whether that's during pregnancy or during different stages of lactation. The baby will make less negative faces when they're eating carrots. Carrots, for example, is one flavor that gets through. In some cases, they'll eat more. But you can see by asking them a variety of ways, by looking at how much they eat, but also the facial expressions made during eating, how these prior experiences modify behaviors. So not only are these flavors detected, but prior experiences will modify the behavioral response to those flavors after birth. And this is not unique to humans. In fact, when I was a postdoc, I think I spent many hours in the vet school library at Penn because in the 70s there was a rich area of research trying to identify how these volatiles got into dairy milk, because it was the height of the dairy industry. It's not just what the cow eats, it's also what she breathes, so that's why they control the ventilation in barns. So they would do experiments where they would actually inject volatiles of garlic into the rumen or into the lungs, and then actually have sensory panels to evaluate the flavor of the milk. Well, if you grew up by a farm, you appreciate those flavors because cows prefer to graze on wild onion and garlic. But in this case, for this mass market, they were trying to get these volatiles out. And I love Fred Provenza, who does wildlife biology, that it's not an innate knowledge, it's learned and part of their culture. I always used to say that this probably is what defines us as mammals, is that we're drinking the milk made from the mammary gland, until a few years ago, French investigators exposed the hen to a particular diet, and if the eggs were then fertilized and then hatched, they would accept a novel food because those volatiles got into the yolk if the novel food was flavored with it. So I think it may be a fundamental feature of vertebrates. And think about, as we're going to talk about later, sustainability. How does one establish a food preference or a food culture, which is probably, during the immigration to a new country, the last feature of a culture that's lost. Language is lost far earlier than food habits. And so you see that many forces of culture are being placed on the sustainability of a food habit. And as we now find ourselves in completely different types of food environments, rich in foods that are really, our basic biology is being attracted to, and that we no longer have the experience of other foods that children don't even get the don't even get the experience to learn to like them. But this is a very sophisticated learning that's occurring in many animals. The mother's teaching them not only what to eat, but how to mix certain foods to lower the toxin load of a particular plant, for example. But the presence of the food in the environment doesn't ensure the animal's going to eat it. And I think that also is a big take-home message that we find ourselves in today. And so how do we get children to like certain types of foods or have a broader palette of foods? And this is just a summary of some of the basic research. Obviously, we first learn to like foods that are a reflection of what mom is eating. What mom eats is most likely what is going to be fed to the child. 8 to 10 days of exposure, the baby will be more accepting of a food after when compared to before. Variety really works. Give the baby 8 to 10 days of variety of a vegetable, they're more likely to accept a novel vegetable. Anything that's paired with sweet, those aromas will be preferred, as well as other nutrients. You've got parental modeling, peer modeling, and these are just some of the ingredients for the sustainability of food habits. But what they really all have in common is they're building on the familiar, increasing in complexity, and that's how children are fed. We weren't designed to have children feed different diets than adults. It was all building on the familiar, where maybe you would modify the texture, but then by most cultures around the world, by 2, children are eating what the adults of that culture are eating, because it is those foods that are defining who the people are. And still to this day, we can all think of the foods that we eat during a special meal, and those are really defined by our experiences and our expectations. But it gets to, it's not just thinking, children are eating what adults in our cultures are eating. And many of them aren't meeting the requirements, for example, of fruits or vegetables. And so many children are being deprived of the experiences to ever learn to like those flavors. And the saying, it's hard to, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. Well, it's a lot easier to teach a young one. And so that's really the emphasis that's been around now, these birth to 24-month campaigns, is to start early. But I would say that they're missing something. You can't just focus on the child. eating and food is much more than taste or learning about it's the family and it's the culture. And so I think if in any type of intervention, we've got to bring in more than just the infant and focus on the family. So I think that where you start often influences where you end up, and that is also a hallmark of what we find, why it's so difficult to change. Mothers are this first source of information for many vertebrates, not just us, and it's providing information of what is the food environment out there. Because these senses are plastic. My favorite story is of the European rabbit, who nurses the young a few minutes a day, and you can tag the mother's diet. And once the young leave the nest, whether the diet was associated with pregnancy or lactation, that the young will be attracted to. So in case the food source changes, the child has gotten that information. But just in closing, food is much more than calories. It's not only, it gives us pleasure, it gives us our identity, and it really is our relationship to the environment. I think in a food environment now we don't realize that as much as we do. We're not always growing all the foods that we eat. But when one looks at this taste system and one looks at how looking at broccoli is not going to work. Has to taste it to learn to like it. One realizes not only the vulnerability of childhood, because of this plasticity, the children need the experiences to learn to like it. So it's my hope that just by understanding the taste world of children, we can develop evidence-based strategies to help promote at a time when many are encouraged to change habits after the birth of a new child, to focus on the family as well. So thank you.